Okay, let's start looking at John Maynard Keynes's model of the macroeconomy. First, we need to make some assumptions which clarify the limits and also the purpose of the model. The first point is to note is that we're talking about the economy here operating in the short run. For our purposes, what that boils down to is that it means that we're going to assume there's no change in technology, no change in major institutions, no changes in consumer habits, and no change in the size of the labour force. The period of time we're looking at is sufficiently short that we can assume that these things aren't going to change. These things take a long time to change. So since we're talking about the short run, we can hold them constant. We're also going to ignore prices, and here by prices we mean the prices of output and the prices of inputs. It doesn't necessarily mean that the prices are strictly speaking being held constant, although that is an assumption which is commonly articulated in textbooks. In your textbook, it's not really assumed that prices are held constant, but it is assumed that the changes in prices are effects only. They don't have any causal impact in terms of the Keynesian model. So we can safely kind of leave them hidden. We don't have to talk about them in the model, except as a kind of aside. In much the same way as the level of employment can change. That's not really represented in the model either, but this is also an effect. Anyway, another major assumption that's made is that the economy does tend towards an equilibrium. It tends towards a given level of output and a given level of income. And that equilibrium condition is that the income generated from the production of GDP that goes to the owners of resources is precisely equal to the expenditure on that GDP. Remember, GDP here is referring to new production. It's not referring to the buying and selling of second-hand goods. Okay, so expenditure on GDP. So when we can just express that in some symbols. So here we've got income from GDP. So if this goes up, it's indicating that more production occurred and therefore more income was generated. And E is standing for total expenditure on goods and services in the economy. This is also sometimes known as aggregate demand, and also sometimes known as effective demand. Anyway, so this aggregate demand or this effective demand or this total expenditure can be divided up into parts. So we have consumption expenditure by households on domestic production, investment expenditure by businesses for the purchase of buildings, new plant and equipment, and so on, government expenditure on the production or the buying of new schools, hospitals, roads, bridges, and so on. And then we've got export expenditure. So this is revenue that flows into Australia from the purchase of Australian produced exports. So that's expenditure on Australian production. But from that we have to deduct import expenditure by households and businesses, and presumably governments as well. They spend money on imported goods which are produced in another country. So we need to deduct that expenditure from the total expenditure engaged in the economy. All right. So we can rewrite this as, that's pretty straightforward, we can rewrite this as y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m. You should note that sometimes the x minus m is written as nx, standing for net exports. Okey-doke. All right, now we've got an equilibrium tendency. We're going to say that there's an equilibrium tendency. So what does that amount to? Let's imagine a situation where the total expenditure in the economy, the c plus I plus g plus nx, is greater than the income generated from the production of goods and services. Or another way of expressing it is to say that expenditure is greater than production, greater than real GDP at a given moment. Now, what will happen if that's the case? Firms will start to realize that their inventories or stocks, their warehouses basically, which have excess stock in them, will start to deplete. They'll realize that they haven't produced enough to satisfy the total demand in the economy. As a result, they will start to increase production. So they'll produce more. To produce more goods and services, they employ more people and pay them. So overall incomes rise. But as households' incomes rise, their consumption expenditure also rises, which seems natural enough. And this will occur because consumption expenditure is rising. Note that consumption expenditure is a part of total expenditure. Because income's rising, leading to consumption to rise, this will continue to occur until the total expenditure equals income. Now you might say, well, how is that the case? If both income and consumption are rising, why should they eventually become equal? Why wouldn't they just remain unequal as we started with? Well, it's because, income increases faster than consumption. All right, so why would that be the case? Because we're going to say that the income which goes to households, not all of that income, that increase in income, is spent. Some of it is spent. Some of it is lost in tax. Some of it is saved, and some of it is spent on imports. So, it means that although income increases by, say, 10, consumption might increase by, say, only 6. Because the rest of the income goes on taxes, savings, and imports, for example. Okay, so far so good. What if, on the other hand, expenditure were less than income? That is, if expenditure were less than the value of the amount actually produced. In that case, businesses would start to realize that they had overproduced, so to speak. Their inventories, their stocks, their warehouses will start to fill up with unsold output. and they will realize in that case that they have produced too much. And as a result, they will react by decreasing production. They decrease production, which results in a fall in incomes. The fall in income translates into a fall in consumption expenditure by households, and this continues until we eventually get back to equilibrium, where total expenditure equals production. Again, why is that the case? Well, it's just the mirror image of what we've already talked about. Because, and this is because, income will decrease faster than consumption decreases. Okay. So, the main point is that we always have this tendency towards equilibrium.